We're going to use this PowerPoint to review some basic biological classification. We use biological classification in order to understand similarities and differences between living things. The largest division within biological classification is the domain, and there are three different domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota. Bacteria and archaea are more primitive. There is some debate among scientists as to which group evolved first, the bacteria or the archaea. So you might read in one book that the bacteria were the earliest living things. You could read someplace else that the archaea were the earliest living things. But they are both more primitive, and then within the division eukaryota, which is what we are, there are four smaller divisions called kingdoms. Okay? The bacteria and the archaea, however, we're just going to talk about them in terms of the domain, and then the eukaryota we're going to break down into four different kingdoms. So I said the archaea and the bacteria are more primitive. They're called prokaryotic organisms. So think that the P's go together, prokaryotic and primitive. They are all unicellular, which means that one cell is one organism, and they have a membrane that surrounds it that separates it from the external environment, but then internally they're very basic. There are no internal membrane-bound compartments. Everything is just sort of floating around, and there is no separation between different elements inside of the cell. Conversely, the eukaryota are eukaryotic types of cells as opposed to prokaryotic. They are more advanced. In the domain eukaryota, we have both single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms, such as humans. Within the membrane that surrounds the cell, there are little compartments, and we call these compartments organelles. One example of an organelle, or a mini organ, is the nucleus, and the nucleus is probably the most important, as that's what holds the DNA, which is our genetic information and makes us unique. In the domain eukaryota, we're going to talk about four different kingdoms: the Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia, and those are in order from the most basic to the most advanced. We're going to start, however, and go back for a minute and talk about the prokaryotic domains. Okay, so the bacteria you're probably familiar with. They are unicellular. We usually think of them as being negative and causing diseases, and there are some that cause diseases, like Streptococcus pneumoniae, which is that guy up there. There are other ones that recycle nutrients, and that's a good thing. Oil-eating bacteria. There are bacteria that decompose waste in the soil. So those are good ones. You also have bacteria on your skin and in your digestive system that are good bacteria that take up space so that the bad bacteria cannot get in and harm you. The other primitive domain is the archaea. And when you think of archaea, I want you to think of extremophiles. These are organisms that, even though they are unicellular and even though they are primitive, inhabit very extreme environments, and these would be environments that probably no other organism would want to inhabit. One example is a thermophile, and the thermophiles, phile means love. These are organisms in the archaea that love to inhabit very hot environments. For example, the hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. Okay, we are going to transition now to the domain eukaryota. These are the more advanced, and they have internal compartments within each cell. The most primitive in the domain eukaryota are the Protista. You can think of these organisms as misfits. They didn't really fit into any of the other kingdoms, so scientists grouped them together in the Protista. One similarity is that they pretty much all inhabit moist environments, so these would be like pond water critters. Some are animal-like. For example, the euglena, it has a tail-like structure that it uses to propel itself through the environment. Some are plant-like. The example is green algae, and you've probably heard of algae before. Algae is not a plant, it is a protista. The next kingdom within the eukaryota is the fungi. Fungi are decomposers, which means that they break down dead or decaying material. And you're probably familiar with some of these. Bread mold, hopefully you don't have that in your fridge. Yeast, which are used in baking bread and making wine and beer, and mushrooms as well, which you might like to eat. So those are all examples of decomposing fungi. Okay, the next kingdom is the plantae, or the plants. I'm sure you're familiar with plants. There are several different groups of plants, but the ones that you are probably most familiar with are the angiosperms. Those are the flowering plants, and the purpose of the flower is to attract pollinators. Flowering plants also have fruit, and the fruit, even though we like to eat it, the purpose is to protect the seed, which is then going to become the next plant. One adaptation or advancement within the kingdom Plantae is special vascular tissue, which is used to transport water and nutrients all the way from the roots to the tallest limbs and leaves of the tree branches. The last kingdom is the Animalia. These are the most advanced, and we fall into this kingdom as well. I've divided it into the invertebrates and the vertebrates. Invertebrates have an external skeleton, so these are insects, spiders, crustaceans like lobsters and crabs. They are more primitive, and they are also ectotherms. And ectotherm is the same thing as being cold-blooded, so they cannot internally regulate their body temperature. Rather, they need to rely on the external environment. We, however, fall into the vertebrate area, as we have an internal skeleton. We have a spine. Vertebrates are typically more advanced. They are larger. They have larger brains as well. And within vertebrates, there are both ectotherms and endotherms. So an example of a vertebrate ectotherm would be like a snake or a frog, but we are endotherms, as are all mammals. We have the ability to internally regulate our temperature. So if we are too hot, we sweat. If we're too cold, we shiver. And that's how we maintain a steady, constant internal temperature. I hope this helped you learn more about the different kingdoms and biological classification.